Gresham College presents The Making of a Masterpiece, The Challenge of the Solo by Professor Christopher Hogwood, CBE.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. May I introduce Pavlo, who you were expecting to see here with one violin, and instead he has brought six. And to those of you who may not have been to some of the previous lectures in this year's series, this is the last in the making of a masterpiece. And you may have noticed, if you have been here to the previous lectures, that the number of performers involved is going in much the same direction as the Greek economy. We started with a sextet, we went down to a quartet, and now we're reduced to one player. It's very pertinent, though, that I plan to go that way because we focus increasingly, as you noticed in the last few sessions, on what are the parameters surrounding the creation of a masterpiece. How does a composer cope with technical as well as artistic challenges? And in fact, is a masterpiece written because of or in spite of the instrumentation or the musical raw material that is on offer? I think if we had opted for the one player today being a flute player or a trumpet player, you might have rather quickly got bored because there wasn't very much option other than just the single melodic line. We want to deal with one player coping with polyphony, basically. It could have been a grand piano, of course, except there isn't a grand piano here, where one player can play an awful lot of notes. It might have been, I suppose, a guitar or a lute, which can, in fact, play more notes simultaneously than a violin, but has no power of sustaining. But the most practical and challenging, and in fact the instrument with the most exciting repertoire, I think, is the unaccompanied violin. And I thought this was an opportunity to build up towards the piece that's been mentioned quite a few times in the course of this year, the Bach Unaccompanied Chaconne, but to see where it comes from, and in addition, where the instrument comes from. And that's the reason that we have this variety, because not all of these instruments, although they're all played with a bow, not all of them have the four strings that you expect. So Pavlo, just show from...
What I'm going to start off with is this beast called a lira da braccio. This is a Renaissance instrument. It was the Renaissance reinventing, if you like, of Orpheus's lyre. They got it completely wrong, of course, because Orpheus plucked his lyre, and this is a bowed instrument. It has 7 strings. 2 are divergent, they're tuned in an octave. I hope it's still in tune and not an octave. The first 2 on the fingerboard are tuned as an octave, and those 2 pairs are very rarely fingered. You basically make all your chords with the top 3 strings. You will notice if I hold it to you this way, it's got a very, very shallow curve on the bridge, and this is what this is the feature that makes it a polyphonic instrument. It's impossible to play single lines on this, whereas playing polyphony on the violin gives you challenges. It's exactly the other way around. So, shall I just play a few little notes?
Just put a date to that. The frontala is about.
It's a strophic song, Italy, 16th century, form.
So there's quite a Italy, I think, is an important defining thing, because most violins that people care about come from Italy.
They do indeed. Yes.
The interesting thing is, though, that where we now assume that it's considerable advance on playing the violin to play more than one note, and in fact adding chords or additional parts on the modern violin, on that instrument there's no option but to play many notes together. Yeah. When you then come to a violin, is the bridge going to stay flat, or is it going to? The more the bridge is rounded, of course, the more the bow can avoid hitting more than one string. That's when it's flat, of course. If it were totally flat, you would just play all four or six simultaneously. So,
I brought this instrument along in its sort of modified form to demonstrate the violinistic polyphonic heritage, if you like, something that comes from the lira. This is what I use for playing Renaissance music. It has a curved bridge, but the piece I'm going to demonstrate a few bars of is by one of the first really renowned virtuoso violinists, Biagio Marini, who played, among other things, for Monteverdi in his band at St. Mark's in Venice. There are many pieces for solo violin not unaccompanied violin, but solo sonatas for violin by Marini. And one extraordinary piece is this Capriccio, which you have as example 1, I think. It's printed in very ancient music printing, so it's quite hard to read. And the few words that you see at the top of that are an explanation of Marini's to move the two thick strings closer together, so that the bottom 3 can be played alla moda della lira, as it says at the top. So it's a rather fascinating missing link, the violin and the piece. I'll just give you a few notes from this, because it isn't actually officially an unaccompanied piece, and we don't have any continuo here. But I'll show you what this sounds like. Introduction. Then we have the advantage, because it's a curved bridge violin, we can play our melody on the top string. And then we're back to that lira style of playing. So there we are, the missing link.
The next step in the development then is to do with the stringing of the violin, or the shaping of the bridge, or the type of bow, or all three.
Well, the next development, I think, in dealing with polyphony on normally strung, not messed about with violin, is to in this piece of Westhoff, which I'm about to do an extract from, show you what some of the solutions are to making 3-part harmony work, sometimes 4-part, to making that work on a bridge which is as curved as that. Because obviously with the straight line of the bow, you're balanced at best on 2. Sometimes with a lot of weight you can get into 3, and that's going to be demonstrated in this piece. Johann Paul von Westhoff was a real pioneer in 17th century violin composition for his contribution to polyphony on the violin. There's a celebrated set of 6 suites which date from about the 1690s, which are really quite challenging. And this piece I'm going to do an extract from was published, is a sort of 17th century equivalent of the giveaway free CD that you sometimes have attached to the front of BBC Music magazine or something like that. It was a sort of A3-size sheet of paper with this rather elaborate violin suite engraved on it to mark Westhoff's visit to Paris, one of several that he made, but this one was in the winter of 1682, I think, if my memory serves me. So what you're going to hear in this is a prelude and an allemande. It's tiny printing there. So it was just to give you an idea. And you're going to hear 4 distinct techniques for making polyphony work on a curved bridge. One is where the first passage, where all the notes are written in sustained values, which is an impossibility to play. So one has to use one's nous and artistry to try and bring out the lines in as best a way as possible. The same prelude is then repeated, the same chord shapes, with a technique known as bariolage, which is this. There I'm not playing the notes simultaneously, but I'm trying to give the impression of doing so. In the allemande, you'll hear 3 notes being played at exactly the same time, once in forte, which requires a rather vigorous bow stroke, but Westhoff complicates things by asking for the same passage in piano. So you'll notice another technique for making that work. So here's the Westhoff, which is example 2.
I love that piano. Just before we move from that and what you explained about the notation, to what extent does playing polyphony on the violin depend on a sort of oral deception? Because you said that the notation, as Pavlo pointed out, if the beginning of that Prelude is written in long, sustained notes. It looks as though it is organ music or something on the page, but in fact cannot be played. There are not many instruments that sort of sponsor a notation that is at odds with what they can actually play. So are they rather like the cinema, relying on the retention of an image on your retina so that it can blur together and make a moving image, that we are hearing that music with some of the harmony expressed and some of the harmony just imagined?
Absolutely. It's a very good analogy, this thing of retention. I've forgotten the name of the
retina.
Persistence of vision.
Yeah.
That's exactly how one approaches, for example, playing some of the more complex fugues of Bach, which are quite finger-breaking pieces, where he writes values which of the main line of expression in large note values, and you can't sustain and jump to the other part of the violin. So there are a number of ways one deals with that, particularly the way you launch a long note, for example, a semi-breve in a bar where there are moving crotchets underneath, to trick yourself and the audience into thinking that note has been sustained. And when, for example, if it's a 4/3 suspension or something like that, it resolves, the way you pick up the resolved note is very important, that it has something of the quality of that note that you've just launched. It's all smoke and mirrors.
I mean, so is piano playing, of course, because everybody is led to believe that the piano is a singing, sustaining instrument, when in fact it's completely untrue. Everybody knows a piano plays a note and it diminishes, and there's nothing on earth you can do to retrieve it once you've played it. But by a lot of subtle grading, great pianists can make you believe that you're hearing a melodic line rather than a series of pointillist points that evaporate. But at least in piano music, the notation shows you pretty exactly what you play. Chopin puts all the notes, little notes, big notes, pedaling and so on. It's a sort of technical chart to what you do. But I think you're telling us that with violin music, you're given the ideal but impossible picture.
Yes.
And the player then has only one way of solving that, or is it up to the player to find different means of putting over the impression?
There are usually 2 or 3 ways you can tackle most passages. I'm thinking here now of fugal movements of Corelli, where often the violin is playing a fugue subject up there, and indeed starts on another string playing some basso continuo line. And again, whether you try and sustain that top note or how you do it is where the art lies.
There was a funny fiction, I think it's fair to call it a fiction, wasn't there, with the Bach bow, some...
Tosi Spivakovsky.
Spivakovsky, that's right, wonderful player, and also a wonderful name for this operation, devised this theory that, as Pavlo was showing, because the difficulty of sustaining on more than 2 strings is that of pressure and actually getting to those strings on the violin. I think he basically just invented this.
It was a total invention.
Bow which was enormously bowed and had a sort of thumb catch, which looks extremely complicated, where you can adjust the tension on the hairs of the bow. So when you wanted to get the hair to cover all 4 strings, you released it, so you slackened it so much, it actually made a rather horrible sound, I thought. But it was possible, although it was completely fictitious, and this was presented as a sort of retrospective solution to the problems that Bach had left us with, if you were to take the notation seriously and honestly as what it said. I think we now are at the conclusion, as you say, that this notation is a way of showing in theory what you'd like to hear, and you can provide different ways. But the way you break a chord, other than bariolage, can either leave an image of the bass note in people's minds or not.
Indeed. Well, maybe we'll deal with that more in detail when we come to talk about Bach, the different kinds of things. But I just wanted to mention, because you were talking about slacking bows and everything, it's just occurred to me, of course, the other great violinist who had a humorous and wonderful way of making four-part harmony work was the jazz violinist Joe Venuti, who was apt to, in the middle of a solo, undo the frog from the bow, turn the stick round the other way, hold the hair, and just drag it across the four strings. And I don't know if you've ever heard this, it's a fantastic effect. He could do an imitation of, the whole saxophone section of a Count Basie big band as part of his solo. So that just occurred to me, in fact. Maybe that's what
Yes, I suppose one should qualify this thing about not being able to hit these strings. It is easier to get them from underneath, because some Yugoslav violins and some folk violins, and I think also some Indian violins, it's bowed the other way around. The hair is under the strings, I think, and you sort of pull it upwards. And that
the erhu, I suppose, the Chinese stringed violin. Yes.
But that's
the
to actually we don't demonstrate.
I'm not going to do that. No, that was a very specific technique, and he was absolutely brilliant at it. Check out Joe Venuti; he was wonderful. Yeah.
Good.
So back to single lines, I think we were.
Yes. Is this the moment to show a very small single line before you get on to polyphony? Here's the answer to people who found the normal violin too bulky to travel with. This is what they call a pochette, which was favoured, of course, by the dancing masters. If your job was going around teaching people to dance, this was a very French occupation on the whole. The dancing master had to carry his own music with him, and so was devised this little tiny instrument that could slip into the pocket of your tailcoat. And so the dancing master would pull it out of his pocket, hence the pochette, and it really plays.
It's really out of tune as well, isn't it?
I'm not sure I could stand an extended recital on the pochette. I think for the practical purposes of having a tune to dance to.
Exactly.
There's no polyphonic music written for a pochette, is there? I rather hope
Well,
not.
the only music I know which implies specifically a pochette is Monteverdi in Orfeo. There's a moment in an early scene where some birds are twittering outside, and he uses two of these little things just for a matter of four bars.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do sound like
So
birds.
high, squeaky and single line. Yes,
Yeah,
I don't
thanks,
see
Chris.
chordal thing.
No,
Okay, back then to real life. We mentioned that the main factory for the making of all these stringed instruments would be various Italian cities. Nobody has quite put their finger on why Cremona and a few other cities became the established centres of this, but there was a congregating of violin makers. There was an availability of suitable wood. There was a call for music, of course, in Italy. Whether the secrets of Stradivarius are to do with his varnish or the fact that the wood was floated in from the sea and absorbed salt, there are many, many theories for why great violins are great violins, and I don't think anybody has really managed to analyse the DNA of a Strad and replicate it yet, have they?
not replicate it, but there are some wonderful modern makers. I mean, really, really great.
Is the secret of the varnish still thought to be part of the mystique, or is this just
part of
Dan Brown?
Part of.
Right.
But also one has to realise that Varnish and the instruments are different from when Strad made them. You know, the Varnish oxidizers. If you look at Varnish like that, for example, this violin actually has quite a lot of varnish left, of its original varnish left. This dates from about 1676. But what you're looking at is a bit like looking at wine that's too old to drink. It goes a sort of slightly browny colour. You know, this is not what this instrument would have looked like to begin with. So the varnish is oxidizing, the wood is drying out over the years, so they change. But if you see instruments which have barely been played, like the famous Lady Blunt Stradivari, which was sold actually at auction just last year, they look very different from the normal sort of brown violin that you see there. Because that instrument was hardly played in its life, it looks remarkably like a new violin. Beautiful, but or the Messiah Strad in Oxford.
In the Ashmolean.
In the Ashmolean.
Yeah. And do you think, as well as looking different, it now sounds different?
The violins, of course, have been modernised. Is that what you're getting at?
I'm just wondering whether ageing... I mean, when we started doing... forming orchestras with period instruments in the last century, there was, of course, a clamouring to have set up violins in the Baroque manner, and there weren't a lot of very famous ones that were available to put back into the Baroque manner. Most of the famous violins had been... the Strads and so on had been modernised in order to make them saleable to and playable by great virtuosi who wanted a higher tension instrument for playing big concertos. And so makers, quite a few good makers, started making modern copies based on good early models. Mm-hmm. And everybody was very surprised. I particularly was very surprised how wonderful some of these instruments sounded straight off, because I think I've been brought up on the theory that almost all violins sound a little bit green and young and acid, and like wine have to mature a bit and to be left, and that gradually the sound materializes. Of course, you never say this of a Steinway piano. You know, the newer it is, the better it is the common assumption. But it seemed to me that went for some of these violins too, that there was not a lot of evidence that age was going to make them better.
No, they were just very, very good to start with.
Yes.
Good to start with.
So maybe these theories of aging...
we can never know. Old Strads are old, and there is definitely something, there's an age factor somewhere there and contained in the sound, but there are many instances of people doing taste tests, if you like, between Strads and modern violins, and either not being able to tell the difference or even favouring the new Strad. I was lucky enough to study for a while with a great violinist called Charles Libov in New York. He owned the last instrument which was authenticated by Stradivari. And because it was such a temperamental instrument, he very often, towards the end of his life, when he was, any concerts that he had, would often favour, get this, a Chinese factory-made instrument that he was asked to sponsor. And it just worked. It sounded like an open A string, thrillingly bright on every single note, all the way up the G string, all the way up the D string, everything. It's extraordinary. Whereas the Strads are or can be notoriously temperamental. The humidity changes by 1 degree and a whole part of the G string clams up, or you look at it in a less than approving manner and it starts squeaking on something. So they're very temperamental, but incredible violins.
And when you look at some of the very old ones, you see how old was Strad when he died. You can see that when he was doing the cutting, his hand was shaking, and so there's not a clean line, but a shaky line as he cut out some of it.
Yes. It says 1734 or something.
Yeah.
I should know that.
Very old. Okay, back to Italian music. My point about the instruments hailing mostly from Italy is a prelude to the fact that most of Europe was wowed by Italian players as well, and so every country, England as much as anywhere, went really overboard when not only the violin arrived, but with it the practitioners who, of course, all the standard old English musicians declared them all to be charlatans, of course, straight away. But a few of the observers in England, Roger North in particular, picked out the arrival of the violin in England in the hands of Nicola Matteis, who was a fairly shrewd, but I think a great Italian, but a great showman. And he published, for presumably the benefit of the British players, which must have included amateurs, sets of pieces suitable to the violin and notated in such a way that more elementary players and advanced players could play them, that he gives you the basic line of the piece, if you are a beginning player, is just melodic. If you're a more advanced player and can manage polyphony, then here are little dotted notes that are the second or sometimes the third part that show what polyphony he was expecting to be possible.
Ingeniously practical way of using that engraving. As you say, just by punching little
they look like little
ghost notes, that so that more advanced players can play some double stops and maybe the odd triple stop. The piece I'm about to play is not really in the style of all those things that Matteis published. 4 books, I think, of airs for the violin. This exists in a manuscript in a library in Dresden, and it's I think it's one of the 2 example 4s you had. I can't count.
So it's the end page, or might look like the front page, and it's labelled Con Discrezione.
Yes, I don't quite know what he means about that. I'll try to play with as much discretion as I can. I think this is interesting as a piece because it seems it's a sort of proto-Bach prelude. Actually, if you look along there, you'll see just a few triple stops, quadruple stops occasionally, and this, I think, marks a sort of separation of bass and treble voice. So a little bit like in Bach, I'm going to play this first C chord, for example, in such a way that hopefully the C is going to carry on in your loving memory until we reach the B halfway through the first bar, and you're going to experience a descending bass line.
I love the way he turns off the style at the end and just ends as simply. Yes, Roger North acclaimed Matteis, saying he, of all men in the world on the violin, he could do wonders upon one string. But as you say, the effect, the oral image of the implied bass is one of the things that holds the piece together harmonically. So you can have a variety of spread chords, but so long as you know that there is an implicit imaginary bass line going on. I presume that's why both the next two pieces you're going to read, Biber and Bach, adopt a form that you would have thought was the antithesis of what the violin ought to be doing, the chaconne or the passacalia. If any of you were here 2 or 3 lectures back, when we did a lot about the repeating bass pattern of the chaconne, the ostinato, that starts as a single bass line maybe, and then you pile up different variations and constructions over it. That's a perfect formula, of course, if you're we had examples for orchestra, for keyboard, for continuo accompaniment and voices, Monteverdi for 2 tenors and this sort of thing. It's fine if you have a lot of multiple parts all consistently available. It does seem a slight contradiction in terms, though, for an instrument that has to give up playing the melodic line if it's going to show you the bass, and vice versa, has to give up the bass if it's going to carry on the argument above. So this is based, all these famous pieces are therefore based on an illusion.
Indeed, yes.
The Biber begins in the simplest way. I know we're just giving you the bass. Not once, it's not hard to memorize either, that bass.
The bass isn't. The piece, you can go wrong. That's why I'm using the music. Yes, it's a very simple descending bass line, 4 notes, sorry. G, F, oh, you're getting this on the mic. G, F, E flat, D, sort of. I'll tune up in a minute. And this is repeated 65 times or something. I don't know if there's any numerological significance to that. But it's an ingenious piece for the way that's sustained, and ever more complex variations are added on top in typical Biber, notey style often.
it's clear you don't get very far away from that pattern of 4 descending notes, and you don't get any hint, one little hint of modulation, and then a wonderful moment of a turning into the major at the end. These are all contributory ideas that one can see in the Bach Chaconne, which we would go on to. Matteis says that the quickest way of killing your best friends is to play them 2 chaconnes in succession. So I apologise for this, that we probably need to move on to Bach to show the 2 questions in my mind, though, that sit with the Bach outside all these technical parameters that Pavlo has so beautifully demonstrated. One is this, a question that's always bandied around: what is the meaning of the Bach? Can you analyse it by numbers? Is there some secret behind it? One lady has written a book that shows there's a chorale lying in the background of this music. Somebody else has said if you count up all the variations in the Bach Chaconne, they act as a sort of diary of Bach's life year by year, and therefore that a terrible moment where it suddenly turns into the minor was when his first wife died, and then when it comes back into the major, when he remarries Anna Magdalena and things like this. They've got it all. Do you place any faith in any of these descriptions? Or are they all Dan Brown?
Dan Brown. I don't know that they help me in playing. There's certainly a narrative, if you like, going on, but I'd rather not hazard guesses about, this is where he had a cup of coffee, and this is where,
And the other thing, of course, that many people, I think, quite rightly ask is, why does Bach choose such a medium in spite of which to write a chaconne? Would this same music not be easier on the ear and the technique if it were scored for the organ or the orchestra or the keyboard? And in fact, Bach himself made arrangements for keyboard of some of the unaccompanied violin music, so clearly it was adaptable. What is the great... We can see what the great challenge is of playing it on the violin, but what is the virtue of the music being cast for the violin, where you have to do a certain amount of imaginary extension to it, rather than playing on an instrument that would play all the notes all the time if you required them?
Well, I think the biggest advantage is that one has sustaining possibilities, admittedly not all at the same time. One has more dynamic possibilities of crescendo, diminuendo, and of course the violin is prided for its closeness to the sound of the human voice, which I don't think you can say about the harpsichord.
I hope.
So those are really the reasons, I think.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.